This is not a story about politics. It is a postmortem. We are not looking for grand speeches or ideological battles. We are looking for the evidence left behind in a ruined body. Imagine a man who commanded an empire, yet could not command his own hands to stop shaking. His eyes were wide, his pulse was racing, and his veins were not veins anymore. They were hardened tunnels carved out by a decade of daily needles. We are conducting a chemical investigation into the wreckage of a human being, a man who hollowed out his own country from the inside, fueled by a relentless, invisible war of molecules. The history books call it a strategic defeat. The autopsy suggests it was a chemical collapse. Forget the flags. Forget the massive rallies and the screaming crowds that filled stadiums to the horizon. Those were just shadows on a wall. Look at the evidence instead. Look at the biological reality of a 56-year-old man whose internal organs had collapsed into the condition of someone twice his age. When you study the medical records, the picture that emerges is not that of a leader at the height of his power. It is the picture of a body fighting a civil war against itself. The arms tell the most brutal part of the story. If you were to trace the pathways of his veins, you would find they were no longer supple blood vessels. They were like buried, rusted wires under the skin. A decade of daily injections had turned his veins into hardened, scarred tunnels. The nurses and doctors who saw them knew the truth immediately. This was not medical treatment. This was a systematic destruction of the body's infrastructure. Follow the nerves. Trace each pathway burned out by the constant, aggressive surge of stimulants, then ruthlessly drowned by the heavy, thick blanket of sedatives. Then, the cycle would start again. The damage was cumulative. What remained was a central nervous system resembling a circuit board with its wires melted. The tremors were not a sign of age. They were the physical manifestation of a system that had forgotten how to regulate its own energy. His fingers would twitch without his permission. His jaw, once the instrument of his authority, could no longer stay still. This was the silent, internal reality behind the public mask of granite discipline. The world saw a man of iron will. The reality was a riot of chemical reactions. We are going to dissect the substances that hollowed out an entire empire. The leader of that empire was our specimen. The real combatants of history were not just the soldiers on the front lines. They were two armies of molecules fighting over a single, rotting body. On one side, the stimulants, demanding conquest and sleepless nights. On the other side, the sedatives, whispering that the world was still under control, even as the walls began to close in. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The First War was not fought in the fields of France or the steppes of Russia. It was fought in the 30 feet of coiled, tortured intestine that had plagued him since his youth. Long before he held the fate of millions in his grasp, he was a man struggling to survive in the flophouses of Vienna, living on a diet of stale bread, milk, and stolen pastries. That early damage was the foundation of his physical ruin, and it never truly healed. In the mid-1930s, the body was not a fortress, it was a collapsing republic, ungoverned and at war with itself. He suffered from cramps so severe they would fold him in half during the most critical meetings with diplomats and generals. His gut produced gas that no diet, no matter how strict, could silence. It was a humiliating, internal betrayal. Aides learned to keep windows cracked even in the biting chill of February, when the freezing wind off the mountains cut through the thick wool of their uniforms. His breath carried a fermentation that visitors could smell from across the room. People who met him recorded the experience. He would lean in to speak, and the odor was strong enough to push a man back a half step before he could stop his own instinct. The man who promised to purify a continent could not even purify his own bowels. The decay pushed through to the surface. His shins broke out in patches of weeping eczema that refused to heal. During state functions, he would scratch at his legs through his trousers until the skin tore. By the evening, dried blood crusted into the wool of his socks. His valet, Heinzling, had to change those socks twice a day and burn the worst of them in the kitchen stove to hide the evidence. His diet swung between frantic, desperate extremes. After the suicide of his niece, Jelly Robbel, in 1931, he cut meat from his life entirely, claiming the smell of cooked flesh nauseated him. He existed on raw vegetables mashed into paste, chamomile tea by the liter, and spoonfuls of linseed oil. None of it reached the root of the problem. He was convinced he was dying, and for the first time in his life, he was not entirely wrong. His body was a system in revolt, begging to be conquered. And in the winter of 1936, at the Berghof, he found his occupier. Theodor Morell did not enter as a healer, he entered as a man with a syringe, ready to claim the territory. Theodor Morell did not arrive with a medical degree that commanded respect. In Berlin, the real physicians refused to share a room with him. They called him a charlatan to his face, mocking his clinic where he treated the vague, rich person ailments of the elite with mysterious injections of his own design. His own appearance was a contradiction. His fingernails were rimmed in black, his shirt collars turned yellow within hours of laundering, and he wheezed heavily after climbing a single flight of stairs. He weighed nearly 300 pounds, a man who seemed to be melting under his own weight. But Morell possessed one sharp, predatory insight that the trained specialists had completely missed. He understood that his patient did not actually want medicine. He wanted command. He wanted someone who would not lecture him about cause and effect, someone who would simply force his body's mutinies into silence. Morell's first weapon was not even a drug in the traditional sense, it was a colony of living bacteria. He prescribed Mutaflor, a pill containing live E. coli cultivated from a healthy soldier who had survived a typhus outbreak. Morell was effectively launching a foreign army into the civil war within his patient's gut. Surprisingly, it worked. Within weeks, the cramps softened. The constant gas production thinned out. The man who had been folded in half by pain could now sit through 4-hour meetings with Mussolini without flinching. To the patient, Morell was no longer just a doctor. He was a miracle worker. He was a lifeline. The rewards followed quickly, a villa on a private island, a fleet of Mercedes, and, most importantly, the keys to his own veins. The first province, the stomach, had fallen. Now, Morell set his sights on the capital, the bloodstream. His new instrument was a glass ampoule he labeled Vitamultin. On the outside, it was marketed as a harmless vitamin tonic. Inside the syringe, it was pure, unadulterated glucose, fuel pushed directly into the veins. The first time it was administered, the rush hit like a high-voltage switch being thrown. For a man whose digestive system could no longer absorb energy from food, this was not medicine, it was a resurrection. His exhaustion evaporated in seconds, his eyes brightened, and his voice returned with a jarring intensity. He spoke for 3 hours without pause, no longer a patient, but a host. Morell now held the on switch to his Führer's consciousness. The leash was firmly attached. Then came the armored division, small enough to hold between 2 fingers. It was a white tablet, stamped with the eagle of the Temlawerke pharmaceutical firm. The label on the bottle read Pervitin. Today, we identify it as methamphetamine. By 1938, Germany was flooded with the stuff. It was sold without a prescription at corner pharmacies, stirred into morning coffee by housewives, and chewed by students preparing for exams. It was even baked into chocolates marketed to overworked mothers to keep them in a good mood. A nation was effectively eating speed for breakfast. Morell, however, saw a deeper, more singular application. When the Führer swallowed his first Pervitin, and later received it by injection, the molecule did not just gently lift his mood. It performed a hostile takeover of his brain chemistry. It forced his neurons to flood the synapses with dopamine and norepinephrine in quantities the human body was never designed to produce. The effect was not happiness, it was a cold, impenetrable certainty. Doubt ceased to exist. Caution became a word in a language he no longer spoke. Every plan felt divinely inspired, every enemy felt small, and every gamble felt destined. He was no longer making decisions, he was receiving revelations. This was the fuel that would set Europe on fire. The chemistry of the Chancellery did not stay contained within those walls, it spilled across borders. The Führer would stay awake for days, pacing the long, polished marble galleries of the Chancellery while the SS guards stood in silence. At 3 in the morning, the building was a tomb, save for the rhythmic, frantic sound of those footsteps. He would talk without pause to generals who were physically unable to keep their eyes open. He redrew maps on long oak tables, demanding speed, demanding shock, and demanding the impossible. The Wehrmacht obeyed because, in many ways, the army was operating on the same frequency. In April 1940, military doctors ordered millions of Pervitin tablets for the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Panzer crews chewed the tablets as they drove for 50 hours straight without sleep. Pilots took them in the cockpit before bombing runs. Infantry swallowed them during forced marches. When the British were trapped at Dunkirk, the German army had not slept for 4 days. The Blitzkrieg was not a doctrine of genius, it was a chemical condition. A whole army was marching to the same synthetic pulse as the man who commanded it. France fell in 6 weeks because France was fighting a war, Germany was fighting a chemical hallucination. The chemical surge that had crushed Europe in 18 months eventually slammed into something that a syringe could not solve, a thermometer. By November 1941, the massive invasion known as Operation Barbarossa had stalled in the frozen mud and ice outside Moscow. Reconnaissance officers could see the spires of the Kremlin from a village called Khimki, just 8 kilometers away, but they never got closer. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Engine oil turned to sludge inside the panzers. Metal bolts welded themselves to rifle barrels from the extreme cold. The grease in machine gun mechanisms became wax, jamming weapons after only a few rounds. Soldiers were forced to urinate on their rifles just to thaw the firing pins. Hitler had refused to authorize winter clothing, arrogantly insisting the campaign would be over by October. Now, his men were stuffing their tunics with stolen newspaper, cutting blankets into makeshift leg wrappings, and losing fingers to frostbite in the night. As the front lines outside Moscow began to die, the war inside the Führer's own body entered a catastrophic new phase. The same Pervitin that had once handed him the gift of invincibility now turned and bit him. Methamphetamine does not give, it only loans, and eventually, it collects. The brain, whipped for years into producing dopamine on command, started to shut down its own internal factories. The receptors were burned out. The man who had once stayed awake for 3 days now could not sleep at all. He lay in the bedroom of the Wolfschanz, his mosquito hell in East Prussia, staring at the wooden ceiling. He listened to the wind move through the pine forest while his heart hammered at 90 beats per minute, even when he was completely still. The certainty he had felt earlier now curdled into a dark, suffocating suspicion. His focus dissolved into a jagged obsession. He began to scan the faces of his generals, looking for ghosts of treason. He kept lists of old grievances in his head, pulling up insults from the 1920s as if they had happened that morning. Then, the tremor began. It started in his left hand, a faint, rhythmic shake when he reached for a teacup. Within a year, it had crept down into his left leg. He became a master of hiding it, moving his hand behind his back or keeping it hidden under a table napkin, but the damage was visible to those close to him. His own nervous system was filing a report against him, and the verdict was clear: the body was failing, and the synthetic god was coming down to earth. The end did not arrive on the battlefield, it arrived in the silent, suffocating depths of a concrete bunker. By late 1944, the industrial spine of Germany had been peeled apart by Allied bombers. The pharmaceutical plants that produced his chemical supply, the Merck factory at Darmstadt, the Temlerwerke in Berlin, were reduced to piles of twisted steel and radioactive rubble. The supply chain was severed. The dealer had run out of product. For the man inside the bunker, whose brain had not produced its own dopamine or endorphins in years, the reality of withdrawal was not just a sickness, it was a total collapse of his perceived world. The opioids that had paralyzed his gut were gone, and his intestines woke up in a state of violent, agonizing revolt. He doubled over in pain, gripping the edge of his situation table, while his general stood by in awkward, terrified silence. The dysentery returned. The sweat soaked his tunics through, followed by bone-deep chills that left him shaking so violently he could not hold a teacup. He demanded an electric heater be brought into his room, even though the bunker was already sweltering from the heat of the generators. But the nerves screamed the loudest. Methamphetamine withdrawal did not bring the dramatic intensity of his earlier years, it brought a flat, gray, unmovable terror that settled into every cell of his body. It was a vacuum where his certainty used to be. He aged a decade in 2 weeks. His hair, which had been dyed brown in secret for years to maintain the public image of vitality, turned stark white at the roots. His voice, once a booming instrument of power, cracked when he tried to speak above a whisper. His left hand shook so violently that he could no longer sign his own name without bracing his wrist against the desk. The unedited footage from his final days shows a man who was already a ghost, his hand trembling as he reached out to pinch the cheek of a teenager, a movement that had to be cut from the official reels to hide the decay. On his final day, with the enemy closing in and his chemical empire in ashes, he was a hollow shell. The man who had once commanded the movement of millions across a continent now only commanded the space of a few small, damp rooms. The drugs had promised him he would be a god, but they only succeeded in turning his own body into a prison. The chemical war was over. The specimen was gone. All that remained were the records, the track marks, and the silence of a history that would finally be stripped of its myths. The autopsy is complete. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.